In the dead of winter, deep in a forgotten forest, a mother dog lay tied to a tree, her breath shaky, her newborn pups huddled at her belly, and no one left to hear her cry. She was abandoned without food, without hope. But then, from the snow came 3 tiger cubs, alone, cold and motherless. Instead of fear, there was stillness. Instead of a fight, they found family, and that's how a dog with nothing left became a mother to the wild. This is not a fairy tale, it's a miracle written by something greater. And it all began with a single, silent prayer beneath the pines. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. The sun had not yet risen over Cedar Hollow, Montana, but the sky was already bruising with the deep, steel-blue light of early winter. Snow dusted the tall pine branches like powdered sugar, and the frozen earth crunched beneath tires as an old black pickup rumbled down a forest maintenance road. The temperature hovered just below 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Breath turned to mist. The trees stood still, tall sentinels to a silence that rarely broke, save for the cry of a hawk or the groan of wood under frost. Cliff Barton sat behind the wheel with both hands gripping the leather-worn steering wheel, his knuckles pale beneath his thick gloves. Cliff was in his late 50s, with a sun-damaged face, a strong jawline, and eyes that had long ago lost their softness. He wore a dusty beige jacket that had seen too many seasons, and a flannel shirt with one button missing. Once a logger, now a man who lived mostly off the grid. Cliff had grown increasingly bitter since the shutdown of the Cedar Hollow mill 5 years ago. A divorce, mounting debt, and the creeping solitude of his mountain cabin had hardened him into someone even the townsfolk no longer tried to understand. In the back seat, a German shepherd lay curled tightly on a torn blanket. Her name was Shadow. She was 5 years old, lean but once muscular, with a sable coat that gleamed silver gray along her back and warm rust along her legs. Her ears twitched with each turn of the road, but her eyes, dark, expressive, were tired. Between her front paws, nestled and shivering, were 3 tiny pups barely a week old. Their eyes had not yet opened, and their whimpering came in waves as they pressed blindly against their mother's belly, still seeking milk. Shadow had once been Cliff's pride. He had picked her from a working litter for her intelligence and drive, trained her to fetch, to guard, even to signal distress when he fell ill one icy night. But after she became pregnant, an accident from a neighbor's stray male, he no longer saw her as useful. Cliff didn't believe in weakness, and raising pups, he told himself, wasn't part of his plan anymore. The truck slowed, gravel popping under its tires. Cliff pulled over beside a tall pine with gnarled roots and branches that bent low, heavy with snow. He stepped out, boots cracking through the frost, and walked around to the back seat without looking once at the dog. Shadow's ears perked. Her tail gave a faint, hopeful thump. But Cliff didn't speak. He opened the door, grabbed the edge of the blanket roughly, and yanked it forward. The puppies gave a startled cry. Shadow stood on shaking legs, letting out a soft whine, in one hand. Cliff carried a coil of rough rope. He knelt and tied it around the base of the pine. Then, in a motion almost too practiced, he looped it around Shadow's neck. She didn't resist. Her trust in him ran deeper than fear. When he pulled the knot tight, she blinked slowly, confused, then turned to look back toward the truck as he slammed the door. Cliff reached in one final time and set the wooden crate down next to the tree, where the pups now lay in their blanket. Then he straightened, brushed snow from his sleeves, and without a single backward glance, walked to the driver's side and drove off. The sound of the engine faded into the trees. Then there was nothing. Shadow strained against the rope as it bit into her neck, letting out a sharp bark that echoed through the cold. The pups stirred, their cries louder now, small bodies writhing helplessly in the blanket. She turned to them and lay down as close as the rope would allow, curling her body around the crate to shield them from the wind. Her breath warmed their faces. Her nose nudged them one by one. The rope tightened again as she tried to move closer, too short. She let out a soft whimper, half pain, half confusion, and pressed her muzzle into the snow. Just 5 miles away, the small town of Elk Bend still slept under quilts and rooftop snow, inside a modest yellow house on Ashridge Lane. Noah Carter sat cross-legged on the wooden floor of his bedroom. He was 11 years old, small for his age, with sandy blonde hair that always seemed to fall across his eyes. His pale blue pajamas hung loose on his thin frame. In his hand was a green-colored pencil. On the page before him, he sketched the shape of a large dog under a tree. Beneath her belly were tiny forms, pups, or maybe kittens. He wasn't sure yet. His strokes were soft, hesitant. Noah had not spoken a word in almost 2 months, after his mother passed away in a car crash that left only her wedding ring and a broken rosary. Noah had gone silent. The grief was too large for language. The world had become distant. His father, David Carter, a former military medic turned local veterinarian, tried every gentle method to coax him back. Art therapy was the only thing that held Noah's attention. Now, Noah added snowflakes to the top of the tree, tiny white stars falling through gray pencil clouds. Then he paused, head tilting. He drew one more line, a rope. Downstairs, David stirred milk into his coffee, unaware of the forest echoing through his son's hands. Back in Cedar Hollow, the forest wind picked up, fluttering dry pine needles down onto Shadow's back. Her ribs showed through her coat as she trembled. The puppies were quiet now, their bellies no longer full. One of them whimpered weakly, and Shadow responded with a slow, tender lick, her eyes closed. And for a moment, she imagined the warmth of a cabin fire, the steady beat of boots on wood floors, the voice she had once known saying, "Good girl." But the wind answered instead, far off. A tree branch cracked sharply under its own weight. Shadow flinched but did not move. She curled tighter, heart beating slow and tired. Her pups pressed against her chest. And the forest, in its quiet, watched on. The second morning in Cedar Hollow broke with a stillness that felt like glass, fragile, waiting to shatter. Pale sunlight filtered through pine branches heavy with ice, casting a dappled glow across the frost-hardened forest floor. The wind had calmed, but the cold had deepened, wrapping the trees in silence and stealing warmth from every breath. Shadow lay curled tightly, her back pressed against the bark of the pine she was tied to. Her sable coat was rimmed with frost. Her eyes, once sharp and alert, fluttered half-closed with exhaustion. She had not moved much through the night. The rope still held her neck in check, chafing the skin. The 3 pups, barely breathing, remained huddled beside her belly, nursing what little warmth they could. Snowflakes fell, soft as whispers. Then, something shifted. A rustle, not the groan of trees or sigh of wind, but the deliberate brush of paw against snow. Shadow's ears perked. She lifted her head slowly, nostrils flaring. Her body went still. The pups whimpered faintly, as if sensing the tension in her limbs. From behind a wall of pine and frost-bitten underbrush, 3 small shapes emerged. At first glance, they looked like shadows themselves, striped, low to the ground, and hesitant, but as they drew closer, the light revealed their coloring, pale orange fur with dark stripes, snow-dampened and clinging to thin ribs. Eyes large and curious peered from wide, rounded faces. They were tiger cubs, no more than a few months old, alone, wild. The first cub stepped forward with a clumsy stride, its front paw sinking into a snowdrift. The second followed, sticking close to its sibling. The third, the smallest, lagged behind, letting out a breathy, high-pitched whine. None of them made an aggressive move. They did not snarl, or tense, or bare teeth. They simply approached the circle where Shadow lay with her pups, drawn not by prey, but by something older. Warmth, life, motherhood. Shadow's lips pulled back in an instinctive warning. A low growl vibrated in her throat, but the tiger cubs paused, not in fear, but in confusion. Then one lay down, right in the snow, just a few feet from her. The second copied it. The third hesitated, then curled beside the second, shivering. The moment stretched. Shadow watched them. Her tail twitched. She lowered her head slowly, ears flicking with indecision. Then, she turned and licked one of her own pups, pulling it closer with her muzzle. The tiger cubs made no move. Instead, the smallest let out a soft purring sound and inched forward slightly, resting its chin against a stick nearby, its flanks rising and falling with labored breath. The circle expanded. Shadow did not move again, not away, not toward, but the line had been crossed. There, in the frost-laced clearing, 7 young lives huddled in uneasy peace, their shared need greater than their difference, species and instinct bent under the weight of something simpler. Survival. In Elk Bend. The town's main street remained mostly quiet that morning. The diner hadn't opened yet. Frost glistened on the window panes of Dr. Carter's animal clinic, where David Carter stood at his office window with a steaming mug of black coffee. He hadn't slept well. His tall frame leaned against the sill. He wore a navy sweatshirt, faded at the sleeves, and his dark brown hair, shot with silver at the temples, was slightly unkempt. There were deep lines under his eyes, but they didn't dull his gentle expression. David had spent most of his adult life in service, first as a combat medic, then as a vet. It had given him a calm, soft-spoken nature that could settle even the most frightened creature. But when his wife, Anna, died in that rain-slick car crash on Route 18, something inside him cracked, not with noise, but with absence. He turned at the sound of light footsteps on the stairs. Noah appeared in the doorway. The boy wore a thick gray hoodie that nearly swallowed his slight frame. His sandy blonde hair was uncombed. In one hand, he held his sketchbook, the green pencil tucked into the spiral binding. David's heart jumped, not because Noah was awake, but because for the first time in months, his son's eyes didn't drift past him. They met his. David lowered his mug. "Hey, bud," he said softly. "Couldn't sleep either." Noah hesitated. Then, in a voice thin with rust, he answered, "There's a dog in the woods." David froze. Noah's lip trembled. He held up the sketchbook and flipped to the drawing from the night before. The dog was clearer now, her shape curved protectively around 3 pups, and beside them, faint outlines, 3 other shapes, striped in orange and black. David stepped forward. "Where did you see this?" "I didn't." Noah's voice was barely a whisper. "But I know she's there, and she's not alone." For a long moment, David didn't speak. He glanced at the drawing again, the snow, the tree, the animals. It looked like a memory, not imagination. But Noah hadn't been outside town limits in weeks. Still, He knew better than to dismiss what a child carried in their silence. David reached out and placed a hand on Noah's shoulder. "Let's go for a drive," he said quietly. "Just you and me." Noah didn't answer, but he didn't say no either. Back in the forest, the day had edged toward late morning. The wind picked up again, stirring flakes into small spirals. Shadow shifted position, pulling the pups closer. One of the tiger cubs had crawled just a foot from her side, and Shadow, too exhausted to object, let it be. Its tiny form pressed gently into the curve of her ribs, its purring low and steady. The other two had settled near the wooden crate, resting their heads on the ledge. None of them had eaten, none of them had shelter, but in that fragile circle beneath the pine, they had each other, and sometimes, in the wilderness, that was enough to keep the cold at bay. The air in Cedar Hollow grew thinner the deeper they went. Tree trunks stretched skyward like pillars holding up a slate-gray sky, and the crunch of boots over frost-bitten leaves echoed louder the farther one stepped from the road. David Carter adjusted the strap of his backpack, glancing sideways at his son every few paces. Noah walked with his head down, arms close to his chest, his sketchbook clutched tightly against his hoodie. His boots were a half-size too big, borrowed in a hurry from the back closet. His silence, though broken at last by a whisper of words that morning, had returned on the trail. But something in his posture had changed. Not fear, not detachment, but a quiet sense of direction, as though he knew exactly where he was going. They had hiked for almost 2 hours along an old logging trail before the first snow began to fall again. Light, scattered flakes, drifting down through the open canopy. David called for a break, taking a seat on a mossy stump while Noah wandered a few feet ahead, his eyes scanning the forest floor. David's breath steamed in the cold. He reached into his coat and pulled out a thermos of coffee. The heat soaked into his hands as he unscrewed the lid. His gaze drifted upward, toward the canopy. That's when he heard it, not the wind, not birdsong, but a bark, high-pitched, sharp, and then immediately silenced. David stood, heart thudding. Noah froze in place. They exchanged a glance. "Stay close," David said. Voice low but firm. But Noah didn't follow. Instead, he turned and pointed off the trail, toward the east, into thicker forest. David hesitated, but something in his son's eyes left no room for argument. They changed course. The terrain grew more uneven. Fallen logs crisscrossed the path. Ice-glazed patches of soil, slick and dangerous. At one point, David slipped, catching himself with a grunt against a birch trunk. When he looked up, Noah had already crested the rise ahead, his small frame silhouetted against the white light. Noah David called, but the boy didn't answer. He disappeared over the ridge. David cursed under his breath and followed as fast as he could. The slope was steep, and by the time he reached the top, his breath came in ragged gasps. "Noah, slow." He stopped mid-sentence. Noah stood perfectly still about 20 feet ahead, at the edge of a clearing. David stepped beside him and saw, beneath a snow-laden pine, a sable-colored German shepherd lay curled in a half-circle. Her body was thin, her fur clumped with ice and dirt, and her breathing shallow. Yet even in that state, she radiated a kind of quiet strength. Pressed against her flank were 3 tiny, squirming puppies, their eyes barely open, tails flicking weakly. But that wasn't what stopped David cold. Just inches away from the puppies were 3 small tiger cubs. Noah dropped to his knees without hesitation. He opened his sketchbook, flipped to a blank page, and began to draw. His fingers trembled, but his strokes were sure. Tears clung to his lashes. David stepped forward cautiously, scanning the edge of the clearing. No adult tiger in sight. He kept his body low, non-threatening. His heart pounded in disbelief. He knelt beside his son. Shadow raised her head. Her ears twitched. She didn't growl. She didn't bark. She recognized him. David froze. "Shadow," he said softly. The name tasted like dust and memory. Years ago, before she had vanished from the search and rescue program. Shadow had belonged to a government-backed K-9 unit. David had helped train her, worked with her during winter drills in upstate New York. She had an unparalleled scent memory and had once saved a boy buried beneath an avalanche in Colorado. Then one day, her handler, Riley, quit, and the dog was never reassigned. Word was, she'd gone home with him and disappeared from the grid. David had thought of her often, but seeing her now, this broken version, tethered by frost and fatigue, nursing a litter of both blood and strangers, his chest tightened with a grief he didn't fully understand. "Shadow," he said again. The dog blinked, ears flicking back. Then she let out a low whine, barely audible. Noah's pencil moved faster. He didn't look away from the animals once. David crawled closer, eyes scanning for signs of injury. Shadow's ribs were visible. Her back leg bore a raw, red mark, likely from the rope that had since snapped or frayed away. Her paws were cracked. The puppies suckled weakly. The tiger cubs lay curled in the snow, sides rising and falling in shallow rhythm. "Jesus," David whispered. A twig snapped behind them. David stood quickly. Turning, it wasn't a threat, just a woman, mid-30s, dressed in a forest ranger's uniform. She had a thick brown braid slung over one shoulder, and her face, freckled and sun-flushed, was tight with concern. Her name tag read, "Sarah Miller. I saw your truck at the service road," she said. Voice curt but not unfriendly. "Didn't expect to see anyone this far in. You two okay?" David nodded. "We're fine. We just found something." Sarah stepped closer, peered past him. Her breath caught. "Oh." She knelt beside the dog, brows furrowed. "That's not just something. That's a full-blown miracle." David gave her a brief rundown. How Noah had dreamed it. How they'd hiked in. She didn't question the dream, she just listened. "I'm going to call this in," Sarah said. "We need backup, a team, if these cubs are wild and separated from their mother. Fish and Game's going to have questions." David nodded. "And if we don't move fast, they won't survive another night." Sarah stood, already on her radio. Noah, still kneeling, looked up at Shadow for the first time. He reached out and placed a gentle hand against her paw. She didn't flinch. The morning light cast long golden shafts through the trees of Cedar Hollow as the forest shook off the night's frost. Inside the temporary recovery station, a canvas-covered field unit set up near the clearing. Shadow lay wrapped in thick thermal blankets. Her puppies nestled against her belly. A portable heater buzzed nearby, humming a low, warm rhythm into the crisp mountain air. The tiger cubs were curled beside them, still too young to venture far. Their striped bodies rose and fell in slow, sleepy waves. A team of specialists from the Montana Wildlife Response Group had arrived just after dawn. Summoned by Ranger Sarah Miller's call, their lead veterinarian, Dr. Lyle, was a gray-bearded man in his early 60s with kind eyes behind fogged-up glasses and a steady voice used to wilderness emergencies. David Carter now worked beside him, calmer than he had been in years, guiding the process with quiet confidence. Shadow recognized him, never once growling. Even as strangers prodded gently and checked vitals. He spoke to her softly between tasks, a kind of lullaby in his tone. Outside, near the tree line, Noah stood in his father's old winter coat, watching the woods with narrowed eyes. He clutched his sketchbook to his chest, though still quiet. There was a new edge of courage to his stance. He was no longer simply a boy grieving in silence. He had seen something beautiful born from pain, and now he was part of it. Sarah Miller approached him, brushing pine needles from her shoulder. She was a tall woman in her late 30s, her long brown braid tucked beneath a Green Ranger's beanie. A small scar ran across her left eyebrow, a reminder of a bear cub rescue she never liked to talk about. Sarah had grown up with 5 brothers on a remote Idaho ranch. She was sharp-tongued, fiercely protective, and had built a reputation for keeping poachers and politics far from the wildlife she swore to guard. "You all right, kid?" she asked, voice even, but not unkind. Noah looked up, nodded. Then, after a beat, he asked softly, "Do you think they'll be okay?" Sarah looked toward the tent where Shadow lay. "They've got a fighting chance now, and that's more than most ever get out here." She was about to add something when a new sound broke the calm, the distant crunch of tires on gravel. Sarah's expression shifted immediately. She motioned to one of the nearby wardens and moved toward the road that curved around the ridge. A black pickup truck rolled into view, kicking dust and melted snow. The vehicle came to a stop, its engine idling with an unwelcoming growl. Cliff Barton stepped out. His face was paler than it had been weeks ago, the red in his cheeks replaced by something colder. He wore the same worn flannel, but his stance was uneasy, unsure. He wasn't the same man who had abandoned Shadow in the snow. Guilt had eaten away at something inside him, and what remained was thin, brittle. He walked slowly toward the site. His boots scraped frost. His hands were empty. David stepped out of the tent, spotting the figure. His body tensed, but he said nothing. Sarah, standing off to the side, moved a little closer, alert, like a wolf sensing tension. Noah saw him next. He knew, somehow, who the man was. Cliff's eyes met Noah's, then, shifting. He looked toward the canvas enclosure. "I saw the pictures," Cliff said, voice hoarse. "She was on the news and the Cubs. People are calling it a miracle." He looked down. "She's my dog." "No, she's not," a voice said. It was small, high, but clear. Noah had stepped forward. His fists were clenched at his sides. Cliff blinked. "What, she's not yours anymore?" Noah shouted, the words bursting from his chest like they'd been waiting years to escape. "You left her to die." His voice rang through the trees. Everyone stopped. Even the wind seemed to hush. Inside the tent, Shadow stirred. She lifted her head and stood slowly, though still weak. The pups murmured softly. The tiger cubs followed her with their eyes, and then, unsteady but determined, Shadow stepped through the canvas flap and emerged into the light. She walked past David, past Sarah, and positioned herself between Cliff and the young ones behind her. Her body, though thin, stood tall. The tiger cubs flanked her. One of them gave a low, warning growl, a small sound, but full of fire. Cliff looked into the eyes of the dog he had once known. What stared back at him wasn't anger. It was something worse. Disappointment. I didn't know what else to do." He stammered. "I was broke, lost my job. I couldn't care for her and the pups, I thought. But she cared for them," David said, stepping beside his son now, even when you didn't. Cliff's eyes watered. "I didn't come to take her. I needed to see her. One more time. To know if she survived, to know if I still had the right to care." Sarah spoke, firm. "You don't." David looked down at Noah and rested a hand gently on his shoulder. "You saved them." "Noah," he said, "you were brave when others weren't. Today, you didn't just find a dog, you saved a family." Noah blinked, lip trembling. But he didn't look away, he stood his ground. Cliff lowered his head, took a step back, and then another. Shadow didn't move. She watched him retreat, her eyes steady, not vengeful, just done. Finally, Cliff turned and walked to his truck. He didn't slam the door, he simply closed it, started the engine, and left. As the sound of tires faded, Shadow exhaled and sat down. Noah walked over and crouched beside her, burying his face in her neck. She let him. Her tail gave one slow wag. The wind at Cedar Hollow had softened by spring, no longer biting but carrying the scent of thawing pine needles and wet earth, where snow once buried the ground in silence. Small flowers now pushed through with shy colors, pale yellows and wild violets among ferns. The forest, once a place of survival, was blooming into something gentler. At the edge of the reserve, nestled beside a glacial-fed stream and a grove of tall cottonwoods, stood the new enclosure, half open to the wild, half managed with care. Its walls were low wooden fences wrapped in mesh, with openings wide enough for four-legged guests to come and go. Inside, a warm shelter of stone and timber had been built, its roof moss-lined, and solar lights hung like lanterns along the edge. Shadow now lived here, the sable-furred German shepherd, once skeletal and battered, now walked with her head high and tail waving slow and steady. Her coat had filled out again, rich in color, thick with health. Though her left hind leg still bore a faint scar, it didn't stop her from playing with the young ones. 2 of her puppies had been adopted by loving families from nearby counties. But one, Rusty, the smallest and most stubborn, had stayed. His right ear flopped sideways, and he followed his mother like a second shadow, often seen climbing atop logs or stealing her food with impish glee. And the tiger cubs, they had grown too. What once were striped bundles no larger than a house cat were now sleek, powerful juveniles with golden-orange coats and soft white bellies. Their names, given by Noah, were Echo, Blaze, and Willow. Echo was the shyest, Blaze the most mischievous, and Willow the calm, watchful one, though the wildlife team expected them to grow apart from Shadow in time. Something unusual happened. They didn't leave, or at least not completely, by instinct. The tigers explored deeper into the reserve during daylight hours, but every few days, as the sun dipped below the ridge, they returned, trotting from the trees with tails high and bodies loose, greeting Shadow with low purrs and gentle nuzzles. She would lick their faces like she did when they were tiny, and they would flop beside her like lazy, oversized kittens. The humans called it a miracle. The press called it a viral sensation, but to Noah it was just family. Now 12, Noah Carter had become the quiet star of the Cedar Hollow Sanctuary's outreach program. His voice had returned fully, calm but filled with a certain conviction that drew others in. His sandy hair had grown longer, often tucked behind his ears, and he still carried his sketchbook everywhere. One of his drawings, a scene of Shadow resting beneath a tree, with both her puppies and tiger cubs nestled beside her, had been made into the official logo for the sanctuary's new campaign, Healing Through Nature. On Saturdays, Noah gave short talks to visiting kids. He didn't speak like a performer. He spoke like someone who had been lost and found his way back, through animals, through love, through a dog named Shadow. His favorite line was simple. Sometimes, family chooses you. David Carter watched his son from afar, often standing by the fencing with arms crossed, pride glowing through his tired eyes. His clinic still operated in Elk Bend, but he now volunteered twice a week at the sanctuary, helping with injured birds and wild fawns. His bond with Shadow remained deep. Some nights, she would walk to him and rest her head against his thigh like no years had passed at all. And then there was Cliff Barton. After the story broke of the dog he abandoned, of the boy who saved her, and of the tiger cubs she raised, the town turned cold toward Cliff. Social media was crueler still, but it was the eyes of Shadow that haunted him most. That day in the forest had shattered something inside him, and maybe that was the point. Weeks after his retreat, Cliff walked into the Cedar Hollow sanctuary, and not demanding, not dramatic, just a man who looked older than his years, with shoulders slightly hunched and a quiet voice. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He offered to work. Sarah Miller, now in charge of volunteer management, was the one who met him at the gate. She didn't smile, just handed him a broom and nodded toward the barn. And so he came. Every morning, he mucked stalls, carried feed, scrubbed troughs. He didn't try to pet Shadow, he didn't speak to the tigers, but day by day, he began to smile again, not often, but enough. It was Rusty, the flop-deer pup, who first came to sniff his boot. One afternoon, Cliff sat in the sun on a hay bale, drinking from a dented thermos. Shadow walked by. She didn't look at him, but she didn't turn away either. That night, Cliff stayed to help build a new enclosure, quiet hands with steady nails, and the forest, once again, held its breath. On the first anniversary of Shadow's rescue, the sanctuary held a community gathering. Kids from Elk Bend came with handmade signs. A choir sang. Sarah, who usually avoided crowds, stood tall and read a statement about courage and second chances. David spoke about trauma, recovery, and the power of animals to teach us how to begin again. And then Noah took the stage. He wore his old hoodie and carried a drawing tube in front of the crowd. He unrolled a new sketch. Shadow lying in a meadow, her eyes closed, surrounded by grown tiger shadows, and the pup, Rusty, curled against her side. The crowd clapped. Shadow, resting at the front, raised her head and blinked toward the boy. And in the last golden light of day, Echo, Blaze, and Willow patted down from the trees behind the crowd, calm as ghosts, and lay beside her once more. A circle complete. Sometimes the greatest miracles aren't loud or sudden. They begin in silence, in the quiet cry of an abandoned soul, in the small, brave step of a child, or in the warmth between species that were never meant to belong together. Shadow didn't just save lives, she redefined what family means, and in doing so, she reminded us that God's grace often shows up in the most unexpected places, through animals, through second chances, and through the people willing to stand in the gap when no one else will. If you are struggling, grieving, or feeling forgotten, know this: healing takes time, but God is never far. His love reaches even into the coldest forests, the darkest nights, and the hearts we thought were beyond repair. Just like Noah found his voice, and just like Shadow found her purpose again, you too can begin again, if this story moved you. Please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and type Amen if you believe in second chances. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and join us as we continue to share stories of love, faith, and the quiet miracles that remind us we are never truly alone. May God bless you and everyone you love.